Thank you. Well, hello. It's just about 5 o'clock, and we are going to have a lecture this evening from Jane Siddell. I'm Mark Gardner. I'm one of the vice presidents of the Royal Archaeological Institute, and I'm chairing the meeting on behalf of the President, Ken Smith, who's not here tonight. Jane is going to talk to us about the archaeology of the Greenwich World Heritage Site. Jane has been an archaeologist in London for 25 years. She studied at the Institute of Archaeology at UCL, and then she did her PhD on sea level change in the Thames at the University of Durham. She's worked as an archaeological scientist, working at the Museum of London, and then subsequently at English Heritage, and then moved over when English Heritage split into English Heritage and Historic England to Historic England, and she has become, or has been, an inspector of ancient monuments in London for a bit over a decade. So she has some marvellous sites under her charge, and they include the Greenwich World Heritage Site. And Jane this evening is going to talk to us about the archaeology of the Greenwich World Heritage Site. Before she starts, just let me mention that if you want to ask questions, you can enter those questions into the live chat box on the right-hand side of the screen, and Matt, who is helping us this evening, will relay those questions to Jane after she's spoken. So Jane, the archaeology of the Greenwich World Heritage Site.
Right, can everyone see that? Mark, can I ask if you can see that screen?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
super. In that case, I will assume that we are good to go. So I'd like to thank the RAI for inviting me to speak. That's very kind and a great privilege. There's nothing I like more than talking about the sites that I help to look after, along with all sorts of people. You're not meant to have favourite scheduled monuments, but Greenwich contains a number of really fabulous ones. And the reason I wanted to talk about Greenwich tonight was not just because they're really fantastic sites, but really for any of you that might be visiting London over the summer. Greenwich is quite an accessible area. It's 10 minutes on the overland train from London Bridge Station, quite easy to access. Much of this is all out in the fresh open air, easy and free to visit. And so really I'm acting as a tour guide tonight to give you some ideas for easy and safe sites to visit in the coming months. Mark has introduced me thoroughly. I'm a dirt archaeologist, happiest down a hole. I am behind a screen or a computer quite extensively at the moment, but really my passion is for going out on sites, helping people with them, and I'm lucky enough to have about 175 scheduled monuments to look after. And I work with the owners and agents, with the archaeologists, and with people trying to protect, conserve, and let people know about them and tell their stories. And that's what I hope to do tonight. I thought I'd pick the World Heritage Site because the World Heritage Site includes a cluster of all sorts of heritage, listed buildings, registered park and garden, and the scheduled monuments, and of course lots of undesignated archaeology as well. We're lucky enough in London to have 4 World Heritage Sites, all of which contain scheduled monuments, and they're all on the river, and that's quite interesting. There are, I think, 20 now in England, and apologies for just talking about England, but that's what the firm pays me to do. It's not that I'm England centric, but it's just that the facts and figures in my mind tend to be related to England rather than the UK, so apologies for that. So we have 4 World Heritage Sites in London. We have Westminster, Abbey and Palace of Westminster. We have the Tower of London. We have the Kew Botanic Gardens, and we have Maritime Greenwich. Maritime Greenwich, I don't know if you can see my cursor. Maritime Greenwich is up here on the top left, I hope, of your screens. This is to give you a better idea of the location. It's directly opposite the Isle of Dogs down in southeast London. and sits on the south bank of the River Thames. This map gives you the extent of the World Heritage Site, which is outlined in yellow, and then the buffer to the World Heritage Site, which helps protect the setting of the World Heritage Site. Important to note that the buffer does go across the river, but it doesn't go very far across the river. And the World Heritage Site is primarily composed of Greenwich Park, which is enormous, and then the series of buildings of the Maritime Museum, the Old Royal Naval College, and then a little element of Greenwich Town itself. The site was inscribed as a World Heritage Site in 1997 for its outstanding architectural and scientific genius. And I love this. It's a very explanatory and powerful statement. It leaves you in no doubt as to what the site is about. I won't be talking about the scientific side of it particularly this evening. There is a great deal to that, but I can't easily cover both the archaeology and the science just in one go. This gives an impression of the architectural side of it and the maritime side. It's not just the association with the river, it's the association with the Navy and with maritime history. This is an illustration which is showing part of the procession of Nelson's funeral, and the site is associated with the Navy. It's associated with the Greenwich Hospital for seamen, which was more an almshouse than a hospital per se. But there are a great deal of maritime and naval connections. This is a slightly more restrained view, and this is an important one. This is a painting by Canaletto of looking south into the World Heritage Site from the north bank of the River Thames. And this image is an outstanding one and is now a protected view. And so it's protected in the London View Management Framework to assist with planning, and it's something that we use. And occasionally when people suggest they may want to build things, even temporary things such as the Olympics, we're able to point to this image and say, our site is largely unchanged, so it is protected, and it's protected for very good reasons. It is the most outstanding site, and it's why really I want to commend it to any of you that are able to visit. This is an image, again, coming through time. This is from the renowned photographer John Gay. And as I've said, much of the site is significantly unchanged over the last couple of hundred years. Now, I'm not going to talk particularly about the archaeology within the town centre. That has been less well explored than the archaeology in the park. But just to show a few elements of the World Heritage Site, this is St Alphege Church by Nicholas Hawksmoor in the town centre. And this is the Grade 1 listed building, the Cutty Sark. And again, the maritime and the trading connections are very much a part of the World Heritage Site. And the Cutty Sark forms very much a part of that. So to start with the archaeology, and apologies, I'm going to look over because I've got some facts and figures on another screen over here. It's surprising, and I do hope at some point that some prehistoric material will pop up, but we do have practically no record of any prehistory at all within the World Heritage Site. Now, this could simply be an evident absence of evidence, because in many ways the park has been quite lightly explored for its archaeology, and prehistory is lacking, and yet Greenwich Park is really quite a high point. It's a high-level gravel terrace with an unusual chalk outcrop. The geology and the topography is really quite well suited for prehistoric occupation, of which we have a surprising amount in the London area, including in central London, but Greenwich Park as yet has not given up its prehistoric secrets. So we'll go straight to the Roman period. And I have stolen, of course, an awful lot of these images from the internet and from colleagues and partners. We start in 1901. The park keeper at the date, A.D. Webster, was a real history buff. He wrote quite extensively on the history of the park and was fascinated by some of the findings. And he and an antiquarian colleague, Herbert Jones, were looking for the line of Watling Street as it comes up from the southeast, heading towards the Roman site of Londinium in central London. And they were carrying out surveys in a fairly loose manner and turned up some tesserae. And so in 1901 and 1902, they extended that hunt for Watling Street to try and identify what it was that the tesserae had come from. And they came upon a Roman building and undertook a series of trenches. And I don't know whether this is Webster or Jones, or in fact someone else. And obviously the lady is neither. So I don't know who this is, but this is the site of the excavations at the time. So really quite intriguing. It was thought at the time that it was a site of potentially a Roman villa. But a great deal of very interesting material turned up. Some fragments of statuary turned up, some inscription turned up, and a great deal of coins turned up. I think 350 coins covering several centuries. And I particularly like that there's a coin of Mark Antony. She's very interesting indeed. They also had some ivories, and this is a photo the British Museum have given me permission to use. Small ivory, and I hope you can see there's a face here and a lovely flower symbol up here. Slightly uncertain. The item is, sorry, there is no scale. The item is relatively small, and there was also an ornamental ivory belt buckle with this. So the excavations were followed up in 1906 with further work, and then in the 1920s, but nothing more was added to the story from those excavations. The site was relatively deeply buried with a series of layers, looking like there were a series of phases of the building. But it wasn't until 1979 that more work took place, and this came in the light of Dutch elm disease, which ravaged the park. And apologies for the quality of the pictures. I've taken this from a publication. The Southwark and Lambeth Archaeological Excavation Committee were invited to Greenwich to carry out trial excavation to see if it would be safe to replant trees in this location, because it was known to have the Roman remains. And so Harvey Sheldon and Brian Ewell, legendary figures in London's archaeology, conducted some excavations and found that the Roman remains were really quite extensive on this slight eminence. And it was at this point that the idea started to shift from being a Roman villa to being a temple site. The building lines that they found, the material that they found, the earlier material, including the statuary, the inscriptions, and also the large amount of coins, gave them to think that this might be a temple site and possibly associated with the military. The site was not planted with trees, but a small display area about that big of tesserae with an interpretation panel was left. And then in 1999, the Time team were invited to town and carried out a much more extensive series of trenches in the usual 3 days. We've got to find the answer format, which was not particularly helpful. But they did add to the story in terms of the building phasing, but also they turned up a procuratorial tile, which suggested then that this was some sort of official building. But they also turned up additional inscription, and the work on the inscription combined with the earlier inscription suggested that there was a dedication to the genius of the emperor. And so it was decided on the basis of all the material from all the excavations that this was the site of a temple, probably of a Romano-Celtic design, small square building in a courtyard enclosed with a wall and an outer ditch with some ancillary buildings. And this is a reconstruction drawing done by the time team by the late and much lamented Victor Ambrose, who really brought to life a number of the time team excavations. And so that was the conclusion about the site. It was written up by Becky Wallower, who took this on. I'm afraid the time team did not write the site up, but it was written up by Becky Wallower and published in several articles in the London Archaeologist. I got involved with the site particularly from about 2008, when it became clear that the 2012 Olympics were going to happen in Greenwich Park for the equestrian events. And I put this site forward rapidly for scheduling, and it was scheduled so we could ensure that no harm came to it. And in fact, the area was landscaped, protected, and a new interpretation panel was paid for at the time. So there is nothing physical to see apart from the location and understanding the topography, but it's a very good survival in the park and is under no threat whatsoever. So it's a very lovely site, very interesting history, combining both antiquarian interest from the park managers and then from archaeologists over subsequent decades. Moving on to Saxon, Greenwich itself is a derived Saxon place name, and we think we have a small Saxon trading wick centre in the town, and there is a certain amount of Saxon occupation evidence that's come from the town centre. We also have historical evidence of how the riverside settlement under the Naval College evolved, and I'll come to that. But what I want to talk about first is another scheduled monument within the park itself. This is a fabulous photo, and I hope you can see it relatively clearly. This was taken by drone that lovely hot summer a couple of years ago, early morning drone shot with the light coming across the site. This is our Anglo-Saxon Barrow cemetery, again protected within the park and scheduled before the Olympics. And this one was quite funny because I insisted that an exclusion zone be put around it on the day of the equestrian event. And I'm afraid I sat on one of the barrows and shooed the visitors out who were trying to take better photographs of the event. But we were able to put some interpretation out and protect the site, and it was all fine. And it's a fantastic survival. It's one of two Saxon barrow cemeteries in Greater London. I think there's not more than about 33 in England. And again, apologies for being England-centric, but that's where my stats come from. And it's in exactly the sort of place that you would look to find a Saxon barrow cemetery. It's on the false crest of the hill. So the view from down below, close to the river, would be very, very striking. They are diminished now. We know that there were at least 50 in the 18th century when our first record of them comes out. When the site was first excavated with the permission of the park keeper by an antiquarian. There's an image from the history of Kent, and there's a watercolour in the British Museum which shows this. But unfortunately, there was quite extensive excavation by the Reverend James Douglas, and it wasn't quite 6 barrows before breakfast, but it was on that sort of scale. And unfortunately, his records are scant. There are records of a paper he read where he notes that he found the burials within many of the excavated barrows, including timber coffins, surviving hair, surviving shields, swords, daggers, jewellery, amber. And we have no other records, and we have no knowledge where the finds went to. Now, it's it's a very interesting site actually in the history of archaeology in London, not just the archaeology in London, because this is the first site I know where there was a very loud public outcry about destruction of archaeology. And this is from later. Reverend Douglas was excavating in the 1750s, but in the 1840s there were plans for a large reservoir of fresh water to be created in the park to feed down to the Naval Hospital, um, where fresh water wasn't available. Um, Now, this illustration that I hope you can see is from the Illustrated London News, fantastic newspaper, and an amazing source of information. And this dates from 1844 because what seemingly has happened is that the park had given permission for the construction of a very substantial reservoir and had started trashing some of the remaining barrows. Large outcry of people that visited. Greenwich is a great mixture, is a mixture of genteel and really quite poor. And the people using the park on the whole, I'm afraid in the 1840s were the genteel side. And it does give a fantastic illustration here of the ladies in their big frocks and the gents in their top hats. But the paper was really quite thunderous. And I don't normally include text, but I've included a little bit because I do love this. The historic affections of the people were not only wounded, but their rights as Englishmen-ay and as park owners were defied. The thing was not to be borne. And it goes on like this for quite some time, actually, and talks about the ghost of Queen Elizabeth and how she should set about people with axe and blade. And this outcry worked. It was very substantial. It was quite prolonged in the newspaper and locally. And the reservoir was moved slightly to the south. The remaining barrows were protected and were broadly looked after until we came along and made sure that the equestrian events of the Olympics didn't go over them. And we do have a slight problem with walkers in that area, but we are trying to protect them carefully because they are quite vulnerable. The topsoil is really a very thin skim over gravel, so they're quite ephemeral features, but there are still 31 surviving. The Royal Commission did a very good survey in 1993 and 1994, and that shows quite clearly, but some of them are only about 10 centimetres high and the ditches are very fugitive. But the site does survive very well. There are other Saxon remains known. This is not from Greenwich Park, but we have records of hanging bowls from further to the north in the park and other Saxon find spots as well within the park. And we think settlement down in the current town centre. Now, in the medieval period, things do change quite dramatically, and that's because of Humphrey of Gloucester, Henry V's brother. He was granted land in the park and by the riverside. And this goes back to actually King Alfred. So I mentioned that we have Saxon evidence in the town, but we also have landholding records from the riverside to the north of the park. And King Alfred grants land to his daughter, Elstrudis, and she marries, sorry, I'm just going to have to get this quite right. She marries Baldwin II, the Count of Flanders, and they together grant land here in Greenwich to the monks of St. Peter and Paul in Ghent, who form a religious house here. And that carries on quite happily until the time of Henry V, who evicts the alien orders, and he grants a significant amount of land in Greenwich to his brother Humphrey of Gloucester. Humphrey of Gloucester does what many a medieval nobleman does, and he creates a hunting park, encloses land, throws everyone off it, and this was a very good thing for the archaeology. It was a very bad thing for the people at the time, because the land, we believe, was used for common land and for grazing and other rights. But he emparks quite a substantial area, and we do still have traces that you can see on the ground, particularly if you have the Royal Commission survey with you, of the original bank and ditch of that medieval park. And you can also actually see, again, fugitive, but there, we do have the medieval ridge and furrow, which predates that enclosure. So you've got these layers of earthwork still surviving in the park. And it's largely because there has been no development for a substantial period of time. Since this date, it was 13, this is ridiculous, I always get this wrong, 1433. Sorry, I go number blind at this point. And so we have these layers of earthworks that survive. We've got the topography of the Roman temple. We've got the 6th to 8th century Barrow cemetery. We've then got the park cut off from this date. And as well as creating the park and the earthworks that we find, Humphrey of Gloucester also is known to have created a small tower house on the top of the hill where the Royal Observatory lives. And there have been periodic attempts to look for foundations of Humphrey's Castle, which have not yet turned up, but there's going to be another attempt in the next year or so. The Royal Observatory wish to do some works and see if they can find some remains. Duke of Gloucester also, after the monks were evicted, created a manor house down by the riverside. And over time, that evolved from his manor house to Margaret of Anjou's manor house. Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, died in slightly suspicious circumstances. It seems unclear quite whether politics played a larger part than was strictly necessary in his death or not. But the land then passed to Margaret of Anjou, and through her then down to Henry VII, where it went from manor house to the Palace of Placentia, or the Pleasant Place. And we'll come back to that shortly. So with the Tudor period, we get some quite significant development outside the park and in the town area. But we also get a great myth and legend in the park itself. This is another of the earlier photos that I've stolen from the royal parks. And it's a great early image. You see this very sad, largely dead tree, a headless lady down here. It's always been a deer park, and there are still deer in the park in a fairly small enclosure, but it is still a deer park and has been since 1433. There is a little house here, little tiny structure, which is related to a series of conduits that we believe run under the park. You recall I mentioned bringing water from the top of the park down to the Seamen's Hospital. We believe there's quite a series of interconnecting conduit networks that run beneath the surface of the park, and I'll come back to those at the end as well. But this tree is known as Queen Elizabeth's oak and has been known for several hundred years at least. It appears on the first edition Ordnance Survey actually as Queen Elizabeth's tree chestnut, and that is something that has caused great passion and anger locally when some of us have referred to it as an oak. And here's another image of it looking even more covered in ivy, and this is from the very late 19th century. And the park keeper, Webster, who was rummaging around at the Roman temple, he writes quite extensively about this tree, about when it was moribund, when it was colonized, and when he thought it was finally dead in the very early part of the 20th century. And we have records of when it fell over. But it is part of the legend of the park that Queen Elizabeth danced under it, and Henry VIII courted Anne Boleyn. And these myths are great and they're fun and they help tell the story of the park. But occasionally we wonder if we can do a little bit better than that. And so Historic England joined with the Royal Parks to do a little project. And we sent a dendrochronologist out, Andy Morris, and you can see him here drilling the dead tree. Now, you'll all be saying, this is ridiculous, you can't dendrodate a dead tree. And we acknowledge that you can't dendrodate a dead tree. But you can get some information. It's a very substantial dead tree. And we thought we might be able to create a floating chronology. There are some live and quite old oak trees nearby, and some live and quite young oak trees. And we thought we might give a bit of a go, because the question was it an oak? Yes, it was. Was it alive when Queen Elizabeth was alive? And so we thought, for a fun bit of project and for interpretation part of the recently living but now dead fabric within the park, we would see what could be done. And Andy did manage to get a floating chronology through the several hundred years worth of intact tree. We did some work on the statistics, measuring the growth of the trees currently in the park, measuring the girth of this tree, measuring the dead hollowed out bit in the middle, and got a chronology that showed that it was very much alive and actually quite venerable at the time of Queen Elizabeth. And our estimates show that possibly it germinated potentially 50 years before the Duke of Gloucester took the park into control as a hunting park. And so Queen Elizabeth's oak may well actually be part of the original tree landscape of the original common land before the park was enclosed. And so just a small piece of work, but it's added quite a bit to the legend of Queen Elizabeth's oak. We'll never know if she sat under it. It was very much a royal park then, and not for the public or local residents. And we'll certainly never know whether Henry VIII courted Anne Boleyn underneath it, but at least we've given a little bit more evidence to the story. And there she is in the Armada portrait. So I mentioned the Henry VII's Palace of Placentia, the Pleasant Place. This was hugely developed by Henry VIII. Greenwich was very much one of his key palaces. It's where several of his children were born and baptized. It's where various of his wives lived. And it's very much associated with the entertaining of foreign dignitaries as they came up the Thames. It's one of the first places where people would have stayed as they came up the River Thames. It would have been very much on a par with Hampton Court, but unfortunately none of it survives above ground. It hasn't been particularly well excavated, and we don't actually have a good ground plan of it. It was excavated by Philip Dixon in 1970, and you see this newspaper cutting. Very clear survival, very strong survival. You can see some of the classic octagonal turrets. You can see very well expressed building layout. Oops. Unfortunately, despite occasional prodding, this remains unwritten up and unpublished. And this is something that it would be fantastic to see written up. It was a superb set piece excavation with extensive finds and good recording, and it would be lovely to see this written up. There have been some remains discovered since then. There is very little fieldwork that takes place that isn't really service runs and small pieces of work within the Naval College. But occasionally finds are made, and Julian Boucher of the Museum of London has done a huge amount of these pieces of work, and he really is the expert on this site. This was one project that he did in the car park in the Naval College, and this shows the remains of the floor of the Chapel Royal, which was a remarkable discovery. And so bits and pieces of evidence have come to light, but unfortunately it's something where quite a major project will be needed to draw this all together. And this is something that I would like to see done. Greenwich Palace is now a scheduled monument, and it stretches over the road into the grounds of the Maritime Museum. where we know the tilt yard exists. This is the tilt yard where Henry VIII is thought to have had his catastrophic fall that injured him so significantly, and potentially caused him such illness that his personality changed after that. There's recently been a new piece of geophysics over there, which was quite widely reported in the media. We did know the tilt yard existed before, but that did provide some quite good new scans. And much more importantly, the work was done by the University of Greenwich, who have some amazing new kit and have discovered that archaeology is something that they can do quite happily. And they're planning to survey the entire World Heritage Site, which I am more than pleased to hold their coats while they do it. So silly headlines notwithstanding, we've got a great new partnership going with the university, which is very nice. This is quite interesting. I've said that we don't have remains of the Tudor Palace. This is thought to date from possibly 1603 or 1605. It's the undercroft from the palace. So I think we can get away with saying it might be 1605, so it might technically be Stuart, but it gives you a very good idea of the fabric, of the quality of the build, and of the remains that do survive below ground. This has been cleared out and is part of the foundation, the basement of one of the blocks of the Naval College, and we have discovered that the architects of many of the amazing Baroque buildings were quite free in their reuse of material and building stock that survived on the site. Sadly, this isn't on the public route, but I am working on the occupants to make this more visible and to take more tours into this space when the good times come back and these things are more accessible. But it's a very beautiful, high quality space. Now on the foreshore, which is sadly eroding quite badly, we also have good archaeological remains. So if we hop back to the model, yeah, this is a very small set of river steps. This is a much larger structure, as I hope you can see, using the people as a scale. This started being revealed quite gradually about 10 years ago, and Nat Cohen of the now National Trust, but formerly Thames Discovery Programme, has done a fantastic piece of work on this site over the years, which is being carried on by current members of MOLAP and the Thames Discovery Programme. And this shows, I think, the full scope of the site as it's eroded. We did think at first that this was the remains of the Tudor jetty associated with the Tudor Palace. We now think it's probably mid-17th century and it's associated with a slightly later phase, but it's still exceptional survival. And a lot of good material finds have come up from the site, but this structure of a substantial, very well constructed jetty survives, but will gradually be lost over time. So it's fantastic that the Thames Discovery Programme have done a strong piece of research and recording, and I'm hoping that will be written up in the next couple of years. So we'll move on to talk about Greenwich Hospital. The names of all the building complexes can be quite confusing. And we go from Greenwich Palace to Greenwich Hospital. This is an image looking from the south to the north to the river. So that jetty that we were looking at is in this location. This building here is the Queen's House. Queen's House is a fantastic survival. It's very important for a number of reasons. We use hyperbole quite often as a profession, and this one is very much at home to hyperbole. It starts with King James and his wife Anne of Denmark. The urban myth associated with the Queen's House, which was built by Anne of Denmark, is that James tore his wife off a strip in public and swore at her because she accidentally shot his favourite dog. Now, whether this is true or not, we don't know, but the consequence was he had to give her a present. And she asked for a building, and being a forward-looking continental lady, she didn't want any of this old tumble-down Tudor English stuff, that was falling down in the palace. She wanted some of this new Palladian Renaissance architecture. And the Queen's House is thought to be amongst the first, if not the first, building in this style, and by a named architect, Inigo Jones. So the building is remarkably important, and I could happily spend more than an hour talking about it, which I won't. It has been quite well studied, and again, the archaeology of it has been studied by Julian Boucher. But what happened was it wasn't quite finished by Anne of Denmark. There was the slight hiccup of the Commonwealth, but come the Restoration with Charles II, this house really came back into its own. And so the queens it's associated with are actually Anne of Denmark, Henrietta Maria, and then Catherine of Braganza. But when we come to William and Mary, they decided that they didn't want to have a royal residence in Greenwich, and they wished to relocate to Kensington, which they did. And they decided to hand the land over to create a hospital for seamen, to be a balance to the hospital for soldiers found in Chelsea. They were attempting to build something to rival Versailles, and what they were looking to do was to use the Queen's House as the centre of a kind of horseshoe-shaped Baroque complex. And unfortunately, the money ran out, and we didn't get that. So, sorry, I'm afraid we're reorientated now. This is the Queen's House up here. This is to the south. And so rather than getting a lovely horseshoe shape, we have the 4 blocks here of what is technically Greenwich Hospital, but is more commonly known as the Old Royal Naval College. And then we have the later colonnades up here. But it is a stunning Baroque set piece. I don't think there's another one like this in the UK at all. The survival is quite astounding, and it's because I think really it was handed from the Crown to the Navy to a charitable hospital, and is now a charitable foundation with a series of tenants. But the remains that we saw Philip Dixon's excavation is under here, and actually Greenwich Palace, the Tudor remains, are largely in this area, but they do stretch all the way through here. And this is where Henry VIII's tilt yard was, and this is where the recent radar survey was. So extensive remains, extensively well preserved, but unfortunately we don't get to have much of a rummage, and that's probably not a bad thing, really. And it's important to write up what we know before we start rummaging more extensively. So that was a slight aside. And this is just another of John Gay's astonishing images, because you see the quality of the survival, the clarity of the architecture. It really is a stunning place for a visit. And you can walk around the site for free. You now unfortunately have to pay to go into one of the spaces within the Naval College, but this is all free to walk around otherwise. This is the bit that you have to pay to go into now, unfortunately. This is the painted hall, James Thornhill's Baroque masterpiece of astonishing painting and royal propaganda. And we've recently undertook a project in here, a lottery funded project, so huge thanks to the lottery and many generous donors, to clean and conserve the paintings, but also to do quite a large service project to improve the conditions. The paintings are deteriorating differentially owing to thermal gain from the windows, and also some of the issues with the airflow. So part of the project was in the undercroft below this floor here, below this floor, to improve climate control, improve services, and improve heating and cooling for the protection and conservation of the paintings, really more than for people. But it did mean that we did get to have quite an extensive rummage around in the basement, and I worked closely because, as well as the below ground remains of Greenwich Palace, which are a scheduled monument, all those buildings that you saw, they are also scheduled and protected as being of the highest national importance. I got a phone call one day from the contractor saying, we found some bricks. We think you might want to drop by and have a look. And this was before COVID, when I could happily go to site at any time I wanted. And they showed me this little group here. We'd had quite a lot of 18th and 19th century remains turning up in the various service runs, but as you can see, these are far more exciting. And so I went down and said, right, okay, well look, we'll move away from just the service run, we'll excavate a little bit more. And I should say that pre-construction archaeology, and particularly their supervisor Tanya, did a fantastic job on this site, which is being written up. And they were absolutely great, very responsive, very flexible, and worked very well with the principal contractor, who were delightful. It's unusual that the principal contractor is delightful, but they really got into what we were finding and all the holdups that caused for their program. And this is what we turned up. We turned up a complete Flemish tiled floor, glaze intact, various different colours and forms of glaze, some Purbeck and some various other building stone in this floor. And the Kevin at PCA, who is the most amazing stone and building material nerd, said Flemish tiles 1450 to 1550. But then the brick got much more exciting, because the brick, even I can spot a good Tudor brick from a distance. And Kevin Hayward dated these to 1520, 1530. Now, it had been more than 10 years since we'd seen any traces of Greenwich Palace, so we got remarkably excited by this. And I'm afraid I started leaping up and down going, we've got Henry VIII's palace, it's amazing. And trying to convince the principal contractor and the Greenwich Foundation that this was a good thing to find in their basement. We had, of course, undertaken a series of trial pits to ensure that there would be no archaeological showstoppers as part of the services work. And of course, the trial pits were over here and over here. Missed this completely. But fortunately, everyone was so excited by the fact that we seemingly had part of Greenwich Palace, but by the impressive and clearly understandable survival, that we were able to start the redesign of the works in this area to ensure that we could preserve them. And I started working quite hard to see whether we might be able to display some of this in what was going to be the shop and the cafe. Now that took a little bit longer and a little bit more fundraising, but as the work by Tanya and the crew from PCA carried on, it became even more impressive than this. And this, I'm afraid, is just a silly photo to show that occasionally I do some work, because I did clean this floor myself with the conservator that was brought in from DBR. And I cleaned this floor myself several times, lying on my stomach and in my stockinged feet. But this is what I got so much more exciting. So we were looking this way before from the west, but in addition to this room over here, we have a sort of butt jointed, slightly sunken room over here. And it's very odd, because the vaulting that you can't make out here is such that even if I was standing in there, and I'm 5'4", I would have had to bend down at the sides of the room. But what was really exciting were all these brick niches, and these are beautifully detailed with a chamfered pillar here, which has a free, it's floating, and it would seem that between these two niches over here, and there is a third one over, something would have been slid underneath. And then we have these additional 4 over here, and this is a closer up view. Yeah, so something would have slid underneath there, probably a support. Now, I think it might have been timber at some times of year, and marble, possibly other. This is clearly a storage room, clearly a flexible storage room with these different sized niches. And the conclusion that we all came to in the end, and I do believe, is that this was a storeroom, but these are actual internal bee bowls. So for overwintering the royal bees. Now, I was aware of bee bowls before this. I've got bee bowls on a number of scheduled monuments, and they're normally in external garden walls. But I was aware at the time of the bee bowl database, which you can look up online if you're interested in these things. And there are a series of internal bee bowls that date back earlier than this, actually, to the late medieval period. And the reason we came to this conclusion is the shape, but also there are no fixings. So there are no fixing positions for shelves, for doors, or anything like this. These larger ones may not have been for bee bowls, and I think because of the shelf going underneath there, probably they were for keeping things cool in this space. In winter, it would have been very cool, and in summer, it might have needed some help to be cool, but it is set down, it's slightly subterranean. And I'm aware I'm wittering too much. We did get really excited by this. This part of the palace is very close by the friary that was within the palace, and it's possible that this is associated with the friary. It's set back from the River Thames. It's a good 150 meters from the river's edge. To the south, and it's possibly in the area of the productive gardens, as well as additional buildings. So we think this might have been service area. We think it might have been under the control of the friars, perhaps as well as the royal household proper. So it's a really interesting discovery, and we were eventually able to put it on display. So this is now visible in the visitor centre and CAF. We didn't go down the glass floor line because I've had too many bad experiences with glass floors. So it simply has a balustrade around the top of it, and you can peer down and get a good look. And this is before the pay perimeter, so you can get in here for free and go and visit it. And it was a lovely survival, a great part of the palace, and it's a very good way to tell the layering of the story of the Greenwich Palace and then the Royal Hospital for seamen. Now I'm going to end by talking about a new project that's coming up called Greenwich Park Revealed. The Royal Parks, who look after Greenwich Park, were lucky enough just before COVID hit to secure a lottery fund project for the park. The park is really astonishing. It's a great survival. I've mentioned already that medieval earthworks survive in it, Saxon barrows survive in it, but it's a really interesting Baroque landscape because as well as being a park, it's part of the formal landscape that was associated with the Queen's house. I've mentioned that Anne of Denmark was very forward looking, very outward looking, very continental in her views. And so as well as her house, she wanted a formal Baroque landscape to go with it, with a parterre and other elements. And I've mentioned that the Commonwealth intervened, and so the plans that she laid didn't come to fruition until after the Restoration. And André Le Nôtre, who was the designer for the grounds at Versailles, amongst others, was brought in to design the parterre and landscaping for Greenwich Park to the south of the Queen's House. And we have a parterre set on the Queen's House. And then we also have this earthwork structure. This is known as the Giant Steps, and this is terraced into the steep slope that progresses from north to south, along with massive avenues of sweet chestnuts, a number of which still survive. And this is another image looking from the north to the south. This is the Giant Steps here, designed, we think, by Le Nôtre. We don't actually think he ever visited, but he did create designs which a number survive. As this was laid out, but over the centuries, we think this was laid out round about 1665, if not slightly earlier. But it's degraded over time, and it's degraded particularly significantly over the last 50 years or so. If you look at images from the 1970s, it's not too bad. But this is what it looks like now, and you can see there is a slope, and I'm afraid it's very popular with sledgers and walkers to the extent that we've put fences in various places. But the steps have been heavily degraded. They've been researched, and there's actually been archaeological evaluation which has been undertaken by Graham Keevil and others, and much research by land use consultants and John Chafe Associates. But part of this project, Greenwich Park Revealed, is to restore much of the Baroque splendour of the design of the park. So the avenues will be greatly improved, and as you can imagine, tree planting is taken very, very carefully. And whilst many of the sweet chestnut avenues survive, many of the trees have been replanted, and very few of the originals survive. They do, and they're greatly cherished, but there does need to be succession planning. Now, it's very difficult to see from this photo, but along here we have the line of the earthwork of the parterre associated with the Queen's House. And again, this has slumped since 1665. And we've taken what I will call a bold but really quite scary decision, that there will be careful work to excavate and reprofile these. As I say, evaluation has taken place. So we know what we have that's original, and we know what we have has slumped on both the giant steps and the parterre. And so this is going to be a great project. It is a bold and scary project, but the park retains some great elements from the 17th century Baroque landscape, and we want people to understand it better, to remove some of the poor planting that's taken place since then, and to give a much better idea of how the park was laid out as a formal landscape, as well as some of the wilderness elements that have grown up since then. As part of the project, I'm delighted that there will be a community archaeologist post. He's been employed and starts in a couple of weeks' time. We've undertaken a number of community archaeology excavations over the last few years, run very well by Graham Keevil for the last few years. And we've been promoting hands-on archaeology in the park to local residents, to kids, particularly from schools, to university students where we can, particularly the University of Greenwich. So we're going to have a 3-year project running where we'll be doing some capital works, some work on the earthworks, community excavations, for example, and also more survey. I mentioned that the University of Greenwich got very interested in radar. And we have a number of Second World War structures. We have some quite extensive air raid shelters that crop up as parch marks periodically, and we're hoping to do a better survey of these. We've got the 1994 survey, but it might be that new survey will lead to locations for those community excavations. Part of one of the air raid shelters was excavated 2 years ago, and a great time was had by all. And very interesting detail came up from that. And in addition to survey on the military structures, I mentioned the conduits earlier. And there's a website reference here too. There's an astonishing amount of research that's been done by a couple of really knowledgeable people on the conduits and the underground caverns that can be found under Greenwich Park. They are really quite mysterious and tricky to date. These two structures that you see are from the 1720s, when Hawksmoor laid out a conduit system to bring water to the hospital for seamen. But there's a great deal more work that needs to be done to fully understand that. And so we're hoping that this project is going to reveal Greenwich Park and restore some of the Baroque and earlier splendour to it. So I commend this area to you if you're able and want to visit. It's a grand day out. There's a great deal to see from the Roman period up to relatively recently, and it's a fresh and open, healthy, and I hope safe place to visit. So thank you very much for coming along tonight. I hope that sparked your imagination and given you some ideas of a site to visit. And if not, you've got the web address here for the Greenwich Park Reveal project, and hopefully you can find some updates on how our project is going. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Jane. I hope there's a virtual round of applause, which you may not be able to hear, but I'm sure is taking place. There is a chance to ask questions, as I mentioned, to Jane. So there's a live chat box on the right of your screen. And Matt, I think, is going to read out any questions which have come up. Matt.
That's okay. It was very much a whirlwind tour to encourage people to visit.
Well, we'll perhaps wait for a few minutes while people have a chance. I think they were probably rather enthralled by what you're having to say, what you had to say.
There is an awful lot there. I have really only scratched the surface with some of the key sites, but it's a fantastic agglomeration of material. And whilst I deplore the creation of the hunting park and throwing out all the locals, it really has led to a very good survival of archaeological remains in there. And because we have had people excavating small amounts over time, we've got a good insight into it.
Well, I think what is so astonishing is the extraordinary range of archaeological remains which are in, a comparatively small area.
I'm sure there must be some prehistory somewhere. I can't believe in such a favourable location above the river and with such an extensive amount that there isn't anything there. It would I think be so surprising. There is very good prehistoric remains nearby in Plumstead and other areas, and I think it's just that because such a large area of the park has been untouched for hundreds of years, there just hasn't been the sort of coverage that we're used to in other more densely populated areas.
Matt, are there any questions for Jane?
We have a question from Barry Eger, who says, thanks for the fascinating lecture. He asks, what were the bad experiences you have had with glass floors?
Ah, yes, good, very good question. When we try to preserve archaeology that's been found inside new developments, for instance, there has been a tendency to think, right, we will create a box and we'll put a glass floor above it so people will be able to see, but the space can be used. And what often happens is that the temperature differential and the moisture differential in the box where the archaeology is and in the nice warm building above leads to condensation on the underside of the glass, which then drips on the archaeology, which goes green and goes moldy. And this has happened in several places. Also, glass gets very heavily scratched. I've got one site with a lovely glass floor which was completely scratched and you couldn't see through it within about 6 months, and that was a very expensive glass floor. And so we've discovered with one or two sites that if it is possible to leave the archaeology to breathe, but to create a balustrade around it so nobody falls in, that works much better because the archaeology then breathes and you can keep an eye on it. Now, it does mean that periodically someone has to go down and pick out all the sweetie papers that get thrown down there, but that's part and parcel of the job. And this one so far does seem to be working quite well because it's in an area with a small cafe and a shop. So the humidity levels do change quite a lot during the day. And the last thing you want is that affecting archaeology, which isn't damp, but is connected still to the earth. So that's the slightly longer answer than necessary of bad experience with glass floors.
Thank you. Are there any other questions, Matt?
There's a question from Chris Lockyer.
Oh, hi, Chris.
Who asks, given developments in geophysics, are there any plans to undertake very large-scale surveys?
Well, The chap whose name is Simon Withers, by the way, because yes, you might have a professional interest in this. I think he's thinking quite comprehensively. At the moment, he's been laser scanning buildings, but he did drag a radar rig over the grounds of the Maritime Museum. And this is quite odd, actually, because as he mentioned in his newspaper interviews, he went to the wrong party and got chatting to me, which is very odd. I mean, it was a formal do that I think we are not generally that comfortable at. But yeah, so he dragged a radar rig. I don't know if he's intending to do the entire park, and I don't know if he's got a drone yet. But he is remarkably enthusiastic because he went in and did some building recording for the fun of it the other day. And quite frankly, for as long as I've got someone willing to go and do work for free in the park and in the World Heritage Site, I'm going to throw things at him. So I think once the community archaeologist starts in a couple of weeks, we will bring everyone together, because there is absolutely no reason why we can't do community geophysics. We really can't. So, and some people I suspect will prefer it to getting on their hands and knees and digging air raid shelters and things. So yeah, I think over time, and if you like, Chris, I can put you in contact with Simon. I think we will probably see quite a lot done over the next 3 years.
And Matt, are there any further questions? Jane, what strikes me about it is your extraordinary hands-on engagement with this particular site. I mean, you're not a local to Greenwich, but you clearly know the area very, very well.
Yeah, it's a site I really love because, as you said, it's the diversity and it's the range of material. It's also the range of partners. So I've got the Royal Parks people who love their trees and are learning to love understanding the layers of history that come with the park. So they've got really enthusiastic, which is great. And then I've got the building nerds down at the Naval College, and they're very interested in their building. But when you start unpicking the layers of it and saying, well, actually, Henry VIII built that bit, and Elizabeth I was born over here, and Anne Boleyn wasn't allowed to actually stay here for a while. She had to be off down the river. And it's the enthusiasm that comes when you tell the stories, and the stories are so fun. I mean, it's full of hyperbole, Greenwich. It really is. And there are so many different elements. So there's a suggestion, Harvey Sheldon has wondered whether Greenwich Park was actually a training site for the Roman cavalry. So there's that element to it. And then you've got the mystery of the Barrow cemetery, but no settlement actually within about half a kilometre. So it's a site I really like. And quite frankly, when the Olympics came to town, the message that came out of government was fairly clear, which is it's going to happen here. And so we thought, right, we'll work with this. We'll do everything we can to designate the sites, protect the sites, but work with everyone to tell the stories and bring them into it. I mean, to the extent that by the Anglo-Saxon Barrow Cemetery, there was a jump for the cross-country route, and they built little Anglo-Saxon longhouses, and so the horses were jumping over it. So it's that kind of silliness that you can have great fun, but it connects with all sorts of people. And so people that were interested in horses suddenly got interested in Anglo-Saxon stuff just on one afternoon. But on that one afternoon of the equestrian event, there were 50,000 people visiting the park. And so if half of 1% of those people went to a museum or read something about the archaeology, that's a result.
Matt, are there any final questions?
That's fine. I can probably talk for far too long about this site. So I hope that's been useful and interesting. And I hope some people are able to visit in the coming months.
I think that's been absolutely fantastic. And Jane, thank you very, very much indeed. I think what came across to me was your enthusiasm for the site. It's not just a job, it's clearly, you know, you are absolutely gripped by it. And as you said, it was telling stories. It's a place where you can tell stories about it, and they are such fantastic stories. I think we should be grateful that World Heritage Site is in your care, because I can think of few people who would care so deeply and so profoundly. And I will take away the image of you sitting on these diminutive Anglo-Saxon barrows and shooing out visitors who had come to watch the show jumping. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me.